This isn't working. Boom, boom. Oh, it is kind of working, but only if I eat it. Can you hear me down the back if I don't use the microphone? And I promise to speak like this the whole way. Okay, let's just dispense with that then. Yeah, some of you have just suddenly realised, oh God, it's Captain Shitecrack, isn't it? The climate catastrophist. This isn't what I signed up my Saturday night for. What we're going to do is, I'm going to do bad cop for a half an hour, and then Phelim is going to do good cop. That doesn't mean that I think that the situation is desperate. I wouldn't be here if I did. The reason I'm here is that it is precisely groups like this, it is energy that comes from within grassroots organisations, within communities, that both works, not always, but tends to work, and endures as well. The things that you do, because they have come from within your community, are stickable. They're not something that's going to get washed away with the next shower of rain. So any negativity that you hear from me, if there's an overwhelming tsunami of despair from everything that I've said, please know that in my heart of hearts, I believe that groups like this, people like this, energy like this matters, and that is why I'm here tonight. Now, all of that said, I'm old enough and I'm ugly enough to remember back to a point in time in 1992, the Rio Earth Summit, when we all believed that climate change was something remote and abstract and to be dealt with by our great-grandchildren and wasn't really going to actually be visible until maybe the turn of the century. I'm afraid the last year and a half has brought home to us exactly how wrong we are in continuing to make suppositions like that, because climate change is here and it's happening, and it's not happening in remote places, it's now happening in Ireland. So what I'm going to do is talk in the round and in the global about what it is that's happening, and then hopefully if somebody starts tapping their watch at about 25 minutes, I will wrap up by bringing it back to Skerries within a half an hour before handing over to Phelim. I don't know how many of you are watching the news in the course of the last 2 weeks, and the absolutely biblical floods in Central Europe. 7 countries, a 4-day weather event, catastrophic floods from Romania to Austria, Hungary, Poland, parts of Germany, bits of northern Italy. It was an event, actually, sorry, we could shortcut an awful lot of time here. Hands up who knows what attribution science is within the field of climate science. Oh shit, not one. Okay, one at the back. Attribution science is based on 150 years of observed weather, drawing conclusions about how much more likely climate change has made an individual weather event. They have done it successfully, peer-reviewed science over 400 times now, and they did a rapid analysis of that weather event in Central Europe. And the bad news is it was made twice as likely because of climate change. But the really, really bad news is the volume of water that fell. The broad rule of thumb here is that for every degree of temperature increase, rainfall will increase by 7%. But the rainfall increase in that particular event over those 4 days was of the order of 20%, which made it an outlier that they can't quite explain, but one that is being seen much, much more frequently now. And the probability of the same thing happening again sounds very remote. They describe it as something that would 150 years ago have been a 1 in 200 year event. Now it is a 1 in 100 year event, which is actually sort of a complicated way of saying there's a 1% chance that the same event will happen in 2025. which really doesn't describe very usefully where we are and what the chances of something similar happening again actually are, because that was an event that happened over 4 days in 7 different countries with a 20% rain increase. They're saying that there is a 1% chance of that happening in 2025, but they're not saying that there's only a 1% chance of a 3-day rain event happening in 3 or 4 countries in 2025. The chances of that would be significantly higher. They did the same kind of analysis for the shit, I'm sorry, that is the only way to describe it, winter that we had, where it started raining at the end of July 2023 and it didn't stop until April 2024. Now, usually these attribution science pieces are done around single weather events, but they decided that there was something so anomalous had occurred in Ireland and Britain over 2023, 2024, that it was worth their while trying to put some kind of analysis on what happened, how much of it was down to climate change, and what the chances of it happening again were. And it's really quite scary, because these events were made 10 times more likely by climate change. The chance of that many storms occurring again in 2025 is a 1 in 4 year event, as in there's a 25% chance that it's going to happen. The chance that those storms will contain as much rain as they did in 2023, 2024 is a 1 in 5 chance. The chance that between October and March will be as wet as it was is a 1 in 13 chance. But again, remember that that's describing that level of rain. The chance that there might be just a little bit less rain is exponentially higher. So we are through the looking glass on this, folks. All of the calculations have changed. Yes, there is in the sort of the natural variability in the background of the contribution that El Nino made and this massive heating events that are taking place in our oceans, and added turbo boosting of the impacts and the effects of all of this. But there is no doubt whatsoever that we are looking at in this country greater amounts of rainfall that we have to deal with. Then there's, as I don't need to tell anybody in Skerries, there's the issue of the rising waters. The documentary series that I just made that was screened back in March, April, we went to Greenland to talk to one scientist in particular. And what I was particularly interested in getting out of him was the discrepancy between what the IPCC says is the agreed consensus around what is going to happen. This is good. This is robust science. There's an awful lot of people who have spent an awful lot of time working out what it is that we can agree is certainly going to happen. But that projection, which is, as you know, for between 50 centimetres and 1 metre by the end of the century, is, I think most people would admit at this stage, hopelessly underestimated. Because when you talk to scientists like the one that I met in Greenland, or scientists that I have met and talked to, frankly, all over the world at this stage, the guys who are in the field and doing the observations are seeing things moving much faster than forecast. In some cases, exponentially faster than forecast. And when you get to see with your own eyes the things that are happening in places like Greenland, bringing that vast ice sheet, 3 kilometres thick, so heavy it has crushed mountains, to within maybe a couple of decades of being at a tipping point where all of that ice is committed to melting. When you see these processes with your own eyes and the speed at which they are moving, those glaciers are moving towards the sea 4 times faster than they were 20 years ago. You understand the threat that this presents to Ireland. Now, somebody here is going to very correctly pull me up on this and say, melting of the Greenland ice sheet doesn't actually contribute to rising sea levels in Ireland, and it doesn't, because one of the peculiarities of the way the globe spins and where the water ends up. But the same processes that we saw in Greenland are happening in Antarctica, and that does change the game for us here very, very substantially. You have this idea in your mind's eye of what a glacier should look like. It should be white. It's a kind of it comes from years and years and years of watching David Attenborough documentaries, which have always presented you with these very telegenic, idealized concepts or visions of what these places look like. The glaciers all around the coast of Greenland are not white any longer. They are either black or grey, because so much soot from forest fires in Canada or from car exhaust fumes in Europe have been captured in the snow and fallen down onto the glaciers, that they have completely changed colour over the course of the last few decades. That has accelerated the albedo effect. Usually a white surface would reflect back 70% of the sun's heat. It's directly inversely proportional now. It's gone the other direction. They absorb 70% of the sun's heat. All of that rain that I've been talking about, that is an increasing phenomenon worldwide, because we are seeing so much more warmth in the oceans, leading to greater evaporation and to further rain. There are many, many more rainfall events over Iceland, over Greenland, further lubricating those glaciers and their passage out to sea. The falling of the ice off the end of the glaciers also warms up the ocean with what they call a jacuzzi effect. And there is these really, really alarming temperatures in the ocean, which are moving in underneath these ice shelves and further penetrating inland and undermining the glaciers from underneath. All of which puts us in Ireland in a situation where we have to start paying a hell of a lot more attention than we have been up until now to coastal erosion and coastal ingression. For every metre that the sea rises, it's going to come in 100 metres. Now just start thinking about the topography of Skerries and what happens in that case. I don't know the town that well, but I had a walk down Church Street this evening, and I kept on casting my eye up the little alleyways out to the coast. And you saw significant portions of this street which are below what you would imagine would be a high tide and a storm surge. I can't say that with any certainty. I'm not a hydromorphologist. But this is a community that is clearly at risk. Particularly when you consider that we are committed now, with the amount of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalents that we have pumped into the atmosphere, we are committed to 5 metres of sea level rise. That's coming. Now, it's coming over the course of several hundred years. Don't ask me how many, because nobody can give you an accurate prediction on that. But over the course of 200, 300, maybe even 400 years, there is 5 metres of sea level rise coming. Maybe out to the end of the millennium. It is, well, frankly, could there be a clearer message about how we need to completely change the way that we do business and stop granting planning permissions in the places that we are now, stop throwing resources into vulnerable parts of our coast, decide on how and where it is that we need to concentrate resources in order to defend some coastal communities and let others go. I want to get into that idea of managed retreat, but I've been negative for long enough now, so I want to talk about some of the positive things that we can do, particularly when it comes to dealing with rainfall. There's going to be ever more cloud bursts with disastrous impacts. We're very lucky that 70% of Ireland is still basically rural and farmland, so there is a kind of a 2 chances in every 3 that when we get one of those catastrophic bursts, it's going to be over open land, forest or farmland, and not necessarily hit a community like this. Skerries is lucky because you don't actually, unlike most other coastal communities, you're not built on a river. You're not very frequently going to find yourself in the situation that Middleton did, where you have this vast amount of accumulated water from the agricultural hinterland all being channeled into a tiny little river at the same time, maybe unfortunately coinciding with high tide. That's not something that's going to happen here. But you do have, in the other GAA pitch, am I right in thinking, the stream which has left that pitch underwater for significant portions of the year? Well, the conventional remedy for this is that we build structures of steel and concrete. We dig deeper channels, we dredge, we move the water out of there as quickly as we possibly can. Phelim is going to talk to you much, much more knowledgeably about this than I am. But what that actually does is it doesn't solve the problem. Usually it ends up moving it on to the next community, or it just speeds the water up and makes it more violent and more destructive because you've channelized it, you've forced it, and you've contained it, and you've given it greater propulsion and energy. Well, concrete and steel will always be needed. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't do that, but we also need to invest an awful lot more in nature-based solutions. I'm sure you've seen and you have heard these. I'm going to show you a clip now. Sarah, if you wouldn't mind starting to line it up, please, of a woman called Mary Burke, who is a geography professor in Trinity and the main energy behind the Slow Waters project, which is looking at finding nature-based solutions, ideas taken from nature to slow that water down, not to stop it and make it disappear altogether, but just to slow down its arrival into population centres so that you're not inundated at the same time that might coincide with the high tide. What you're about to see is kind of a little bit out of context, so I'll explain what it is, but just keep an eye to the physical features that you see here, because these are the kind of things and the kind of actions that I think that community groups like yours could take.
Can everybody hear that? No.
Okay, it doesn't matter. Play it and I'll talk over it now, because it's only me talking anyway. Okay, dramatic pictures. Shannon Callows, one of those parts of the country that we may end up having to start thinking about retreating from. Me at a point where my hair was making an awful lot more sense. Now, this is a bund. That feature has been built into this field. This field that we're walking through floods in the ordinary course of events. When there's one of those big downpours, it will flood, but only for about 2 or 3 hours at a time does the water... Oh, leaky dam, just take a note of that. And we might... So the water will sit there for an hour or two. What Mary proposed with this particular farmer was, how much of a difference would it make to you if I made the water sit there for 6 hours, so that the population centre of the village, a little bit downstream, has this water arriving in a more orderly, less energetic, less violent fashion. He said, yeah, okay, go ahead. It's a well-draining field. Anyway, it's not going to cause too much damage. So the two things that were put into that field was, one was to build this perimeter, only at about a metre high, if you can imagine, around the area that is going to flood up to about here. He loses very, very little arable land to this feature. And it has, in the middle of it, a pipe that wide. So the water that was going to sit there anyway sits there for a little bit longer because it can only drain back out into the stream through this single pipe. The other feature was the leaky dams. The leaky dams mimic what would have been in the landscape many hundreds of years ago, where we had pasture land, but we had more trees in the landscape. Those trees would, in the course of time, fall over and end up in the streams. The function that they perform in the streams is, again, to slow down the passage of large volumes of water. So when they build a leaky dam, they build it over a stream. It has about this much clearance underneath it, so the stream can do its business for 360 days of the year without any let or hindrance whatsoever. But then when they do have those big volumes of water, the logs above it will slow down and gather about 3 or 4 tons of water, cubic meters of water, and delay and slow down their passage on into the river. Now, features like that do actually work. It's a proven concept. It has not saved entire communities. It has reduced the amount of nuisance flooding. It would certainly make a big contribution towards making a GAA pitch in a place like Skerries playable for 11 and a half months of the year as opposed to 6 months of the year. It's not a silver bullet, it's not a panacea, but it is something that can work if it is done in a way that acknowledges that it has to be done with the good grace and the cooperation of the landowner. There is no energy more counterproductive in the environmental movement than that which chastises, finger wags and admonishes farmers and landowners and doesn't recognise them as the greatest single agents of environmental change, nature restoration and climate action simultaneously. And were the Irish government to decide through a vehicle like Acres, perhaps on payments for the farmers who would allow the installation of relatively small, relatively non-invasive features like that onto land that is going to be able to sustain it, is going to be able to, as is in the case of that field, be grazable again within 12 to 24 hours. An awful lot could be done to save population centres like Skerries, not from the big stuff, but from the ever-increasing greater nuisance that rainwater is going to provide. So that's a positive thing that organisations like this can achieve in conversation with landowners in the agricultural hinterland. There is a bigger, thornier question that is going to be a part of what Phelim addresses now, I think, but through a more positive framework, that all coastal communities need to start having, and that is looking to the body of water out the other side and deciding how do we best use our resources in order to prevent coastal erosion, to prevent inundation from the sea, in the knowledge that we do not have the resources to build a ring of coastal defences around the entire island of Ireland. We have to make some choices. Now, nobody likes that conversation because they think that we're inevitably going to end up coming for them. And there is, if the property prices that I have looked up today for seafront properties in Skerries and the prices at which they are still changing hands is something to go by, everybody has either completely lost sight of that old truism, the day you buy is the day you sell, because they are not thinking about 30 or 40 years from now and the chances of getting insurance or the chances of somebody looking at these seafront properties with any huge confidence. And I think that that is because we all tend in the developed world to have an expectation that the state, that the taxpayer will underwrite our individual choices. That is not going to be able to happen in the future. There is a finite amount of money to go around to put into protecting communities like Skerries, and some really hard choices are going to have to be made. A process of managed retreat from some places, those places which prove to be constantly inundated and indefensible in the long run. But let me give you a remedy, an idea that can come from within community groups like this and be channeled on to politicians as discussion points. And believe you me, you have your work cut out for you, because no politician wants or is brave enough to sign their name up to anything that looks like managed retreat or abandoning any part of the coastline. But talked to, there's a number of different versions of plans like this, but the one that I liked the best was one that was proposed by a state senator in California, a Democrat called Ben Allen. He called it buy, rent, retreat. That you would take a property, or a series of properties, in an area that you knew in 50 or 100 years' time was just going to be underwater for 3 or 4 months of the year and was going to be uninhabitable and was too large to defend, and you want to concentrate your financial firepower on greater population centres. So what you do is you approach the landowner, you approach the property owner, and you buy the property from them. The state buys at full market value. That allows them to go off and build somewhere else or buy somewhere else. And if the state has made this purchase far enough in advance of the eventual loss of this property, the inundation, the eventual flooding of it, they can rent it out. They buy, they rent. And if I say far enough in advance, I mean 30 or 40 years, so that it becomes a cost-neutral exercise to the state. They've bought for $1 million, they've rented it out for 40 years, and they've gotten that money with interest back. And then the third part of the plan, you retreat. The state isn't on the hook for huge amounts of money. The landowner or property owner with the emotional attachment to that place has been well looked after and pragmatically looked after, and somebody else has gotten to live at a subsidised rental rate in a beautiful part of the world for a decade or two with the state as their landlord. It's elegant, it's been proven to work elsewhere, and do you think that there is a single politician that I have mentioned this to who has looked upon it enthusiastically? Not one. But that's where people like you come in, because this is not a conversation that might feel relevant to Skerries right now, but if you aren't having this conversation now, if schemes like this aren't in place in 15 or 20 years' time, the people coming after you are not going to look kindly back on this moment and the choices and the things and the decisions that we didn't make. So, I've now yammered on for way too long. I'm going to hand over to Phelim, but let me just reiterate once again, please, that while I have been like a fart in a submarine for the course of the last half an hour, I am mostly positive I really am, about what it is that can be achieved, what can be done by people like you to take the sting out of the worst of what is coming. Thank you very much.